Maria was diagnosed with cancer, but it was Richard who was tested. The fluorescent lights in the hospital hallway buzzed softly as Richard stared at the report clutched in his hand. The words blurred in and out of focus, but the diagnosis was unmistakable. Maria. Stage 2. Gastric carcinoma. He walked out of the hospital room like a ghost and called his mother on the way down the stairs. "She's sick, Mom," he said quietly. "It's bad." There was a long pause on the other end, then his mother exhaled. "Come home, let's talk." That evening, Richard sat with his parents in their small but warm dining room. The scent of ginger tea lingered in the air, but none of them touched their cups. "I'm thinking of selling the old house," Richard said finally. "The treatment won't be cheap." His father stayed quiet, but his mother leaned forward slowly, eyes sharp, unreadable. "We'll give you the deed," she said, "but I have one condition." Richard looked up. "Anything. Tell her it's you who's sick." The words hit like a slap. "What?" "She can't know it's her," his mother said calmly. "I want to see something. If she believes you're dying, we'll know if she loves you for who you are, or just for what you give." Richard stared at her. The suggestion felt cruel, but his mother's eyes were steady. "You're willing to sell everything for her. Let's see what she's willing to do for you." Richard didn't sleep that night. He stared at the ceiling, wondering what kind of man he was if he agreed to deceive the woman he loved. But then he remembered how often Maria had spoken of security, how Susan, her mother, had demanded property before the wedding, how they'd insisted everything be in her name in case something happened. Maybe this wasn't about cruelty, maybe it was clarity. The next morning, Richard told Maria the lie, that it was he who had cancer. Maria blinked. "You?" He nodded silently, letting the weight of the false diagnosis settle in the air. Her face softened for a moment, but then, just as quickly, something else crept in: fear, hesitation. She didn't say much at first. The silence stretched. Later that night, Susan came over. Her voice was low, full of maternal concern, but every sentence pointed toward the same conclusion. Richard should let Maria go, let her live her life. He shouldn't drag her down. "I'm not saying she doesn't love you," Susan whispered. "But if you truly loved her, you wouldn't hold her back." Richard didn't respond. Maria came to him after Susan left, eyes glassy. "If you really love someone, you don't make them suffer with you." He turned toward her, lips parting, but the words died in his throat. She held out a hand and said softly, "Maybe we should divorce. That way, you can focus on yourself, and I won't be a burden." Richard just stared at her. The woman he once believed would stand beside him through anything now offered a quiet, calculated exit. He said nothing. But inside, something had already begun to die. Richard still remembered the first time he saw Maria, standing under a cherry blossom tree on campus, holding a book against her chest, like it was a secret. Her hair danced in the wind, and when she smiled at him, he felt like the world stilled. She was elegant, quiet, composed, the kind of woman who made others lower their voices in her presence. Their relationship unfolded slowly, built not on wild passion, but on steady companionship. He brought her coffee during study sessions. She folded his laundry when he forgot. For their first anniversary, Richard surprised her with a weekend getaway. She didn't cry, she simply said, "Thank you," then kissed him softly on the cheek. That was Maria, not dramatic, not loud, but precise. For her 25th birthday, Richard gifted her a hand-bound leather journal with her initials engraved in gold. She smiled. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers over the spine. "But next time, maybe something more useful?" She didn't mean it cruelly, at least, not that day, but Richard never gave her a sentimental gift again. 2 years later, when he proposed in front of her favorite lake, Maria hesitated before saying yes. Not because she didn't love him, at least, he believed she did then, but because she wanted to make sure everything was secure. That was the first time Susan entered the picture, like a storm. "You love my daughter?" she asked Richard bluntly over dinner. "Then show me something real, a man who's serious provides security, a roof, stability." Susan wasn't like Maria. She was sharp, brash, polished to perfection. Every word she spoke was crisp and intentional. "You'll need to put a house in Maria's name before the wedding," she said, slicing her steak with mechanical grace. "Not after. Before. That's non-negotiable." Richard's mother, who'd been listening silently, finally spoke. "They're building a life together. See, ain't that weight?" But Susan didn't even glance at her. This isn't about greed, it's about fairness. My daughter deserves protection. Richard agreed, not because he wanted to, but because he loved Maria. He took out a mortgage and bought a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. He signed the deed in both their names. Maria didn't fight it, she simply nodded and said, "Now I feel safe." His mother pulled him aside one afternoon, folding laundry in their tiny kitchen. "You're giving up a lot," she said gently. Richard shrugged. "It's marriage, you give, you compromise." His mother folded a towel slowly. "Just remember, some people only love when you're strong, not everyone stays when you're down." He didn't understand what she meant, not then. Marriage was peaceful at first. Maria kept the home pristine, always scented faintly with vanilla and jasmine. She cooked quiet meals, grilled salmon, roasted vegetables, brown rice in perfect mounds. Richard came home to candlelight and her soft voice asking, "Rough day?" And though she rarely said "I love you," her tone was warm, her touches light. For a while, he thought this was happiness. But friction arrived with Richard's father's illness. He suggested his parents move in, just for a while. Maria's face didn't change much, just the barest shift in her eyebrows. "We talked about this," she said. "I need space. I can't live with your parents. It'll affect my work, my sleep, my mental health." Richard dropped the subject, again. Susan, however, had plenty to say. "You're not being responsible," she told Richard over lunch. "What if something happens to you? Where does that leave Maria?" "She has me." "No, she has what you give her, and you're not eternal." Richard clenched his jaw. "That's what marriage is, uncertainty, but shared." Susan raised a perfectly penciled brow. "No, marriage is a contract. And in a contract, every party in it needs insurance." Maria never contradicted her mother. Not even once. Still, Richard tried. On their 3rd anniversary, he offered to take her to Santorini. She declined. "I'd rather put that money into our emergency fund." On weekends, he offered to visit his parents. She said, "Can't they come here for lunch instead?" They didn't come. She didn't invite them. He adjusted, again and again, like a man sanding his own edges down to fit into a frame she'd drawn for him. And then came the diagnosis. Or what Richard told her was the diagnosis. "I have cancer," he said simply. Maria sat on the edge of their bed, her fingers curled around the silk hem of her dress. She blinked, then nodded once. "I'm sorry." No tears, no outrage, just the mechanical pause of someone calculating. That night, she lay beside him in silence. The space between their bodies on the bed had never felt so vast. Richard stared at the ceiling, wondering how many times he'd overlooked her quiet withdrawals, her meticulous boundaries, her calibrated love. Susan came the next day, face twisted in concern, voice sickeningly sweet. "You're a good man, Richard, but don't tie Maria down. Let her live. It's not selfish, it's love. Love." Richard began to forget what that word meant. Maria was calm, composed, just like the woman he met under the cherry blossoms. But there was no trembling in her voice, no crack in her shell, just the soft detachment of someone preparing to escape. "I've been thinking," she said one morning, slicing strawberries in the kitchen. "Maybe it's better if we separate, just for now, so you can focus on yourself." Richard looked at the knife in her hand. It was clean, precise, just like her. She didn't say divorce yet, but she would. He didn't say no, he just watched her hands, how steady they were, how unshaken. Something inside him went still. He thought of his mother's words again. Some people only love when you're strong. Maria wasn't breaking down. She was preparing to move on. Richard sat on the edge of their bed, the fake diagnosis still fresh between them like an open wound. Maria stood by the dresser, brushing her hair with quiet, controlled strokes. She hadn't cried, not once. Instead, she had made him ginger tea that morning, placed it gently by his side, and left for work without a word about hospitals, doctors or treatments. By the 3rd day, she brought it up, not his health, but the future. "I've been thinking," she said over dinner, barely lifting her eyes from her plate. "Maybe we should consider a divorce, not because I don't care, but so you can focus on healing, without worrying about me." Richard stared at her. "A divorce will help me heal?" Maria nodded. "It's cleaner, less complicated. I won't have to watch you in pain, and you won't feel guilty about dragging me into it." Dragging. That word clung to his ribs like a cracked bone. He didn't respond. Silence was his new weapon. Let her speak. Let her expose herself. The next day, Susan arrived with a folder in her manicured hand. She sat across from him in the living room, one leg crossed over the other, as if she were conducting a business deal, not ending a marriage. "I had a lawyer draft this," she said briskly, sliding the papers across the table. "Just some basics. The house goes to Maria, half the savings to her as well. You keep the car." Richard raised an eyebrow. "The house was bought with my money, before marriage." Susan smiled thinly. "But wasn't it gifted to Maria as part of the wedding arrangement? You know how that works in court." Richard didn't pick up the documents. "So you want everything because I'm sick?" Maria entered the room quietly, standing behind her mother. "You're not in a condition to manage property, Richard. You should be focused on your treatments." Richard kept his expression blank. "And if I die, what do I get to leave behind? A car?" Susan leaned forward. "You're already dying. What use is a house to you now?" The coldness hit him like a slap. She said it like she was reading a headline. Final, indifferent. He looked to Maria, hoping for a flicker of humanity, but she simply said, "If it were me, I'd let you go." Richard stared at her. Her voice was soft, her face calm, but her words sliced cleanly. That was the moment it shifted. He could feel the pit inside him turning. This wasn't panic, it wasn't grief, it was clarity. She planned this. Not alone, of course. Miller, Maria's cousin, had always lingered around the edges of their life. A real estate agent turned legal consultant, Miller had often offered advice about property contracts and worst-case scenarios. Once, he'd even joked, "Make sure you have an exit plan, Rich, not everyone dies quickly." Richard hadn't thought much of it then, but now, the words returned with venom. He glanced at the divorce folder. The document was meticulous. Asset breakdown, healthcare contingencies, a clause about medical guardianship. It wasn't something put together in one night. "Who drafted this?" he asked quietly. Susan didn't blink. "Someone Maria trusts." "Of course, Miller." Maria moved closer, her voice still gentle, rehearsed. "You shouldn't see this as betrayal. We're just being practical. What if your condition worsens? I'd be stuck with debt, with hospital bills. I'm not equipped for that. And this," Richard gestured to the document, "this is what practicality looks like to you." She met his gaze without flinching. "Yes. I can't give up my future for a maybe. I'm sorry." He felt something rupture quietly inside him. Not like a scream, not even like a tear, just a clean snap of the thread that once tethered him to hope. Maria reached into her bag and pulled out a pen. "If you sign this now, we can go to the civil affairs office tomorrow." "Why the rush?" he asked. Her eyes flickered, but her smile held. "I just think it's best to get things in order quickly." Richard leaned back, observing the two women in front of him. Susan with her diamond-studded nails, Maria with her perfectly symmetrical expression. Both waiting. Both watching. So composed. So sure. He said nothing. Didn't touch the papers. Didn't argue. But his silence didn't surrender. It was an observation, calculation. Let them believe he was broken. Let them build confidence in their lies. Susan, misreading his quiet as acceptance, softened her tone. "You've always been a good man, Richard. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Think about Maria's security." Security, that word again. It had become a shield, a weapon, a justification for theft. He looked at Maria. "If I survive this," she cut him off. "Let's not make this dramatic. We're trying to handle this like adults." He nodded slowly. "Right, like adults." At that moment, he made a decision. He would go along with it. He would sign, but not because he was giving up, because this was no longer about love. It was about truth, exposure, precision. The game had started, and they had no idea just how sick he wasn't. Richard sat alone in the living room long after Maria and Susan had gone to bed. The silence was dense, almost physical. The divorce papers lay untouched on the table, their edges still crisp, uncreased. Moonlight filtered through the blinds and painted pale bars across the floor, like a prison cell. He stared at the empty hallway and let the question form in his chest like a sickness of its own. Was I wrong to love this deeply? He remembered the vows they had exchanged. Maria had said, "In sickness and in health." But those words, it seemed, were only ceremonial, decorative. The kind you place in a glass frame but never expect to be tested. Because the moment he said he was sick, she didn't stay. She didn't offer to fight. She reached for the exit. And yet, Richard knew, if the roles were reversed, if Maria were the one lying in bed with tubes in her arms, Susan would demand loyalty, sacrifice. They would say, "You're the husband, be a man, take care of her." But when it was him, the math changed, the logic flipped. He became a liability, a ticking clock, an expiration date. Richard buried his face in his hands and sat there, not crying, just unraveling, quietly. In the morning, he began to prepare. He didn't tell anyone, not even his parents. He called a lawyer friend from university, not Miller, someone neutral, quiet, discreet. "I want you to look at these documents," he said, emailing over the draft Susan had given him. "I'm not ready to fight yet, just tell me how bad it is." His friend replied within the hour. "It's a trap, don't sign it, I'll help you, but move carefully." And so Richard began documenting everything. Phone calls, conversations, Maria's attitude changes. He started using the home surveillance system he'd installed months ago, originally to feel safer when traveling for work. Now, it became a vault of truth. Every time Maria and Susan spoke about strategy, manipulation, or money, Richard noted the time and saved the file. Meanwhile, he played the part, quiet, weak, compliant. Maria took it as surrender. She started making calls in front of him, casual, sharp-edged conversations with Miller about legal angles and asset evaluations. She didn't even hide it anymore. And Susan became bold. She came to the house one evening with a box of old receipts. "In case we need to prove how much we contributed to the home." Richard smiled politely, took the box, and placed it on the shelf next to the camera. Then came the subtle threats. "We'll sue if you don't comply," Susan warned one day, her tone still sickly sweet. "Don't make us go after your parents too. They're old, this would crush them." Richard said nothing. He didn't need to. He already knew how this story ended. His mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Don't pull someone out of the abyss if they're pulling you in." He finally understood. This wasn't a marriage, it was a sinking ship, and Maria had found a lifeboat, him. And now she was cutting the rope. Days passed, then weeks. They filed for divorce. The Civil Affairs Office gave them a cooling-off period, 30 days. Maria didn't wait, she brought the drama forward. She cried in front of their building, sobbing about betrayal, about how Richard left her during a time of love. Neighbors watched, some nodded in sympathy, others whispered. Then came court, not for the divorce, yet, but for temporary asset injunctions. Maria tried to freeze accounts. She brought Miller with her. He wore a smug suit and spoke with carefully calculated charm. "We're just trying to ensure my client isn't abandoned without protection during this unfortunate health crisis." Susan sat beside Maria, dabbing her daughter's eyes dramatically with tissues. "She's trying so hard," she said to anyone who would listen. "He used to be such a kind man, but this illness, it changed him." Richard sat 3 rows back in the courtroom, unmoved. He said nothing. He had no intention of speaking, not yet. Let them talk, let them pile on the lies, let the world see the performance. His silence wasn't weakness, it was ammunition. He watched Maria crumple dramatically against Susan's shoulder. He watched Miller gesture meaningfully to the judge, painting Richard as a selfish husband clinging to property while his poor wife sobbed for justice. And still, he said nothing. Because the truth wasn't ready yet. It needed to boil, simmer, turn sharp enough to cut through their performance like glass. Every night, Richard returned home, packed silently, updated his lawyer, backed up footage, and planned. Every day, Maria grew more confident. She stopped pretending in private. She laughed louder. She spent more. She told Susan she was looking at apartments for after the settlement. Richard pretended to be too tired to respond, but his mind was crystal clear. This wasn't about fairness anymore. This was war. And Maria had already burned the bridge. He was just watching to see how far she'd walk before the flames reached her feet. The courthouse hall echoed with soft murmurs as Richard approached Maria, an envelope in his hand. She was seated with Susan and Miller, flipping through legal printouts like she was preparing for a boardroom merger, not the fallout of a marriage. "Maria," Richard said evenly. She looked up with that same cool detachment she'd worn for weeks. "Are you ready to negotiate?" He didn't answer. Instead, he held out the envelope. "This is for you." Susan scoffed before Maria could reach for it. "What is it now, a love letter? Please, Richard, we've moved past the sentimental phase." Richard remained calm. "It's your health report, from the hospital. You were too busy suing me to pick it up, so I did." Susan rolled her eyes and snatched the envelope from his hand. "More games." But as she unfolded the papers and scanned the contents, her expression twisted. Maria leaned in and read over her mother's shoulder, then her eyes froze. Lines of text, diagnosis, test results, stage, progression, burned into her gaze. Her hand began to shake. She reread it twice, a third time. "No," she breathed. This can't be real. I'm fine. I've been fine." Richard's voice was quiet. "You've had early-stage stomach cancer for over a month. The report was ready 3 weeks ago." Maria's face turned pale. "You're lying. This is another manipulation." "It's your name on the report," he replied. "You're welcome to take it to another hospital, get a second opinion, though by now, you've already lost weeks." Susan slammed the paper down on the bench. "What the hell is this? Are you trying to scare her? This is disgusting." Richard didn't flinch. "You thought I was the one dying, and you couldn't get those divorce papers signed fast enough. You even brought Miller to divide the assets, all while she was the one who needed help." Maria turned to him, panic blooming in her eyes. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to." "You did," he interrupted calmly. "You meant every word. You said if it were you, you'd walk away. You said love means letting go. So now, let go." "No," Maria whispered. "I was wrong. I didn't know. I was scared. I thought that I was a burden," Richard said coldly. "And now that you're the one carrying the weight, suddenly it's different?" Maria stood up. Please don't do this. Let's cancel the divorce. I take it back. We were confused. We can fix this." Susan stood too, her tone swinging from defensive to desperate. "Richard. Son. You can't mean this. You're a good man. I know you are. Let's talk. Let's sit down like a family." He raised an eyebrow. "Family? You tried to sue my parents. You told me I was worth nothing the moment you thought I'd die." Maria's voice cracked. "I panicked. I didn't know how to handle it, but I'm here now, and I need you." Richard's tone didn't budge. "You didn't need me when you were healthy. You only want me now that you're sick." Susan stepped forward, her hand trembling. "Then what do you want from us? For us to kneel? Fine." She dropped to her knees. Please help my daughter." Gasps rose around the hall. Onlookers began to murmur. Even the clerk at the registration desk stared, eyes wide with disbelief. Susan sobbed. "We made a mistake. Don't let her die alone. You loved her once, didn't you?" Richard looked down at the woman kneeling before him. "I did. And then I watched her leave me in silence. For weeks." Maria grabbed his hand. "I'll change. I'll make it right. I swear. Let's go get remarried right now." Richard pulled his hand back gently. "You once said that staying through someone's illness was childish, that it was selfish to hold your partner down, so I won't. I'm letting you go, just like you taught me." Maria's tears spilled freely now. Her makeup ran. "You can't mean that. You can't." He leaned in closer, voice low and final. "You once said sickness was a burden. Don't be a hypocrite now." And he turned and walked away, leaving her sobbing on the courthouse bench, holding the report that spelled out not just her condition, but the price of her betrayal. The courtroom was filled with a cold stillness, punctuated only by the sound of rustling paper and whispered legal terms. Maria sat at the plaintiff's table, pale and gaunt, her posture stiff but desperate. Her illness had started showing. Her cheeks were hollow, her wrists thinner, but her eyes still carried that familiar spark of calculation. Susan sat beside her, lips pursed tightly, fingers twitching on the desk. Miller stood just behind them, arms crossed, playing the calm advisor. Richard entered with quiet footsteps, carrying nothing but a small USB drive in his pocket. His suit was charcoal gray, pressed, collar sharp. His face was unreadable. He didn't glance at Maria, didn't acknowledge Miller. He went straight to his seat, nodded to his lawyer, and waited. Maria's voice cracked the silence first. "Your Honor," she said, folding her hands, "I'm not asking for everything, just fairness." The house has been my home too. I invested emotionally and physically into building our life together, and I'm sick. I need stability. The judge, a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes behind narrow glasses, nodded slightly. And you're requesting the court award you the house? Or at least partial compensation, Maria replied. I have no place to go, no means to recover without help. Richard's lawyer stood. Your Honor, we have evidence that challenges the plaintiff's stated intentions. Proceed, the judge said. Richard rose, no dramatic statement, no venom, just quiet strength. He handed the USB to the bailiff. This is home surveillance footage from our shared residence, recorded during the marriage. None of it was edited, none of it was gathered illegally. The footage played on the monitor. Maria's voice echoed in the courtroom. If we push the divorce through fast, we can freeze his accounts before the diagnosis gets worse. I already talked to Miller, he said thus. A car doesn't matter, the house is the key. The video cut to Susan. I told you, his name alone won't hold up if we prove you were dependent. We'll say you took care of him, that you had no income, the court will feel sorry for you. Another cut, Miller this time, tapping on a tablet. If we frame it right, we can make him look negligent. Let me handle the narrative, but we need him to stay quiet until the decree is final. The silence that followed was deafening. Maria's face drained of color, her mouth parted slightly, but no sound came. Miller turned in his seat. This is out of context. The judge raised a hand. Don't insult my intelligence, Mr. Miller. Susan whispered something to Maria, but it was too late. The judge adjusted her glasses, speaking with finality. According to the documents submitted, the house in question was purchased and fully paid for by Mr. Richard prior to the marriage. Regardless of any emotional investment claimed by the plaintiff, the legal ownership remains with the defendant. Maria clenched her fists. As for marital finances, the judge continued, they will be divided evenly. However, given the plaintiff's current medical condition, a humanitarian compensation of 50,000 yuan will be paid by the defendant. Susan jolted. Only 50,000? Maria shot up from her seat. No, that's not enough. This isn't fair. He can afford more. I need more. The judge remained unfazed. You may appeal. Maria turned toward Richard, her voice rising, almost cracking. Is that all I was worth to you, a house and some footage? Richard looked at her, calm, steady, unmoved. You screamed fairness when you thought I was dying, but now that it's you, suddenly everything changes? You know I'm sick, she said, trembling. And you just stand there like stone. You said you loved me once. Richard nodded slowly. I did. I loved you enough to sell everything I had, until you showed me how little that love meant to you. I'll appeal, she hissed. I'll drag this through the courts for years. He didn't blink. Go ahead, drag it out. I've got time. Do you? She gasped at the cruelty of the line, but it wasn't cruel, it was fair, echoed, hers. Maria collapsed into her seat, tears streaming down her face. The same woman who once calmly passed him the divorce agreement now sat shaking, head in her hands, sobbing as if the verdict had sentenced her to death. Susan tried to console her, rubbing her back, but even her composure was cracked. Miller had already slipped out of the courtroom. Richard turned to his lawyer, whispered something, and then stood. He didn't look at Maria again. He walked out the doors with the slow, unshaken calm of someone who had carried heartbreak long enough to no longer feel its weight. Over the next few weeks, Susan showed up twice at Richard's old apartment, but the building manager told her he'd moved, no forwarding address, no phone number, nothing. She showed up at his parents' house, but it was locked, sold, empty. Susan began making phone calls, pleading voicemails, emails, even messages through extended family. No reply ever came. Maria sent one letter, handwritten, pages long. It ended with the words, "If there's any piece of your heart left that remembers what we were, please come see me." Richard didn't respond. He read it once, then placed it in a drawer filled with the hospital bills he never needed. Time passed. Maria's health declined. She no longer had the energy to parade in courtrooms or perform for neighbors. Her friends visited less and less. Her name, once whispered with sympathy, was now followed by silence. She was pitied, but never again trusted. The woman who once argued that love shouldn't mean sacrifice was now utterly alone, sacrificed by her own words. One day, outside the court after a follow-up hearing, Richard stood on the sidewalk while a reporter attempted to ambush him with questions. "Mr. Richard, any comment on your ex-wife's latest appeal?" He paused, considered it, then said only this. "When I loved, she ran. Now that I left, she crawls." And with that, he turned his back to the camera, stepped into the cab, and left without a backward glance. Maria's appeal never reached the courtroom. 3 months after the ruling, her condition took a sharp decline. The cancer that had gone unchecked for weeks while she'd been busy fighting for a house and money had spread. Her treatments, delayed by her own negligence and pride, came too late. She died quietly in a hospice facility, no court appearance, no final legal battle, no dramatic final statement. Just a thin breath, a pale hand clinging to bedsheets, and silence. Richard heard the news through a forwarded message. No one from her family had the nerve to call him directly. He read it once, then closed the notification. No emotion, no reaction. Just a long exhale into the quiet evening air of a city far from where it all began. He stood by the window of his new apartment, watching the city lights blink like tired eyes. "She taught me the cost of blind love," he murmured, "and I paid it in full." People once sympathetic to Maria, the ones who saw her cry outside the courthouse, who believed her soft-spoken pleas and trembling hands, began to whisper a different story. The surveillance footage, released in fragments through the court's official channels, painted a far less tragic picture. Those who once pitied her now watched in shock as her own voice coldly mapped out how to take everything from a man she believed to be dying. The sympathy evaporated. Public judgment didn't come loudly. It came quietly, like doors never opened again. Invitations never sent, comments never left. Susan, ever resilient in the face of loss, attempted to profit off the downfall. She contacted talk shows, tabloids, small YouTube creators looking for scandal. She pitched stories about a cruel husband who let his wife die alone. But the world didn't bite. They remembered. They remembered the footage. They remembered the contradiction. They remembered that when she thought he was the one dying, she asked for a pen, and when she was dying, he walked away. Susan eventually faded into the same silence Maria had entered. Richard, meanwhile, changed cities, names, numbers. The apartment was smaller, simpler, but it was clean, quiet, his. There were no shared drawers, no reminders, no calendars marked with anniversaries. Just space, and air, and freedom. He took a new job in a different industry, slower pace, less pressure. For once, he slept through the night. One afternoon, while clearing out his archived files, he opened the final folder of documents from the trial. Court letters, bank statements. The original divorce agreement Maria had tried to push across the table that morning when she still thought he had cancer. He stared at her signature, firm, confident, prepared. And all of it, built on the assumption that he was the one whose time was running out. He deleted the folder without hesitation. In time, Richard began journaling again. Not for the past, not for her, for clarity, for peace. In one entry, he wrote, "Don't pour all your love into someone just to drown together, because sometimes, the person you're trying to save, is the one holding your head underwater." The words sat on the page for days. He never revised them, never needed to. And when asked once by a new friend, someone who didn't know the whole story, what marriage had taught him, Richard smiled faintly and said, "They said marriage was a bond. They never told me it could become a noose."